So my presentation today will be Task List B concepts and principles. My learning objectives include behavior response and response class, stimulus and stimulus class, respondent and operant conditioning, positive and negative reinforcement contingencies, schedules of reinforcement, positive and negative punishment contingencies, automatic and socially mediated contingencies, unconditioned, conditioned, and generalized reinforcers and punishers, operant extinction, and stimulus control. And one more page. Discrimination, generalization, and maintenance, motivating operations, rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior, verbal operants, and derived stimulus relations. So what is behavior? A behavior is any observable and measurable action. This could include crying, aggression, like punching, kicking, hitting, biting, anything that a dead man cannot do. And I really like this definition by Johnson and Pennypacker. An organism's interaction with its environment that involves movement of some part of the organism. So obviously a dead man cannot move, which is why we follow that logic. So our first ASR is true or false. Crying is an example of a behavior. And the answer is true. Crying can be measured. A dead man cannot cry. Next, we're going to focus on response versus response class. So a response is a single instance or occurrence of a specific class or type of behavior. And a response class is a group of responses of varying topography, all of which produce the same effect on the environment. And I received that definition from the Cooper textbook. So our second ASR, all behaviors in a response class must look exactly the same in order to be put together. Is this true or false? And this ASR is false. Next, we're going to talk about stimulus and stimulus class. A stimulus class is a group of stimulus that share common elements such as size, color, and functional dimensions. A stimulus is something that can act upon, or it's something that can I just had like a blank moment, but a stimulus can be anything that either promotes a behavior or discourages a behavior. Next, we're going to focus on respondent versus operant conditioning. Respondent conditioning is learning through association of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus in order to elicit an involuntary response. And then we remember the Pavlov study with the salvation in order to... Why am I blanking today? Salvation when he sees food, then receives the food. And there was an unconditioned stimulus of I think it was like a bell. Next, operant conditioning is learning occurs through the consequences of behavior. So something that we learn about is a stimulus. I have my notes here. A stimulus pairing procedure in which a neutral stimulus is presented with an unconditioned stimulus until the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits the conditioned response. For example, with the Pavlov study, there was a bell, and so whenever the bell rang, the dog would salivate. And the dog was eventually conditioned to salivate at the ring of the bell. So who discovered operant conditioning? want to fix this because I just messed this up. Oh no. Let's see. There we go. Then I can move myself a little bit. So who discovered operant conditioning? It was Skinner. Next, we're going to talk about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is a response followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus change that results in similar responses occurring more often. And negative reinforcement is a contingency in which the occurrence of a response is followed immediately by the termination, reduction, postponement, avoidance of a stimulus, leading to an increase in the future occurrence of similar responses. So our next ASR is giving praise as an example of positive reinforcement, true or false? And this is true. Next, we're going to talk about schedules of reinforcement. The first being continuous reinforcement, which is reinforcement is provided every time the target behavior occurs, and intermittent reinforcement is only delivered some of the time. There's also ratio schedules. A fixed ratio is when reinforcement is given after a set number of responses. So an F3 would be every 3 responses. The client would receive reinforcement, whether it was praise, food, a tangible, etc. And then a variable ratio is reinforcement is given after a variable number of responses. So that could be a V4, which means that maybe it could be 2 responses, maybe it could be 4 responses. The next question is true or false. Giving reinforcement every 3 responses is an example of a variable ratio. This is false. If it's a consistent number of responses, it would be a fixed ratio. A variable ratio is when the amount of responses differ from one another. Next, we're going to talk about intervals, which are similar to ratios, except it goes by time and not amount of responses. So fixed interval is when reinforcement is provided for the first response after a set amount of time passes. So whether it's 2 minutes, 4 minutes, it's consistently that time amount that has to happen in order to receive reinforcement. So an example of a fixed interval is a child is given a reward after 3 minutes of studying. The next is a variable interval, which is when reinforcement is given for the first response after a variable amount of time has passed, which could be 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes if it was a VI of 3. And an example is a child receives reinforcement after 2 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 3 minutes, averaging about 4 minutes. So every 2 minutes, James earned a star for sitting in his seat. This is an example of what? And it's a fixed interval because every 2 minutes, James earns a star for sitting in his seat. He earns reinforcement for sitting in his seat. If it was 2 minutes, then 1 minute, then 3 minutes, it would be a variable interval. The next topic we're going to discuss is positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment is when a response followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus that decreases the future frequency of the behavior, and a negative punishment is when a response behavior followed immediately by the removal of a stimulus or a decrease in the intensity of the stimulus that results in similar responses occurring less often. Another topic we're going to discuss is automatic and socially mediated contingencies. And automatic contingencies identify circumstances in which behavior is evoked, maintained, shaped, or weakened by environmental variables occurring without direct manipulation by other people. And socially mediated contingencies are contingencies in which an antecedent or the consequence of the behavior is presented by another person. Next, we're going to talk about unconditioned, conditioned, and generalized reinforcers. An unconditioned reinforcer is a stimulus change that increases the frequency of any behavior that immediately precedes by its history with the stimulus. A conditioned reinforcer is a stimulus change that functions as a reinforcer because of a prior pairing with one or more other reinforcers. Back to when we were talking about Pavlov. And a generalized reinforcer is a conditioned reinforcer that, as a result, may have been paired with many other reinforcers, and it does not depend on an establishing operation for any particular form of reinforcement for its effectiveness. So true or false? A token economy is an example of a generalized reinforcer. And this is true. Stimulus control is a situation in which the frequency, latency, duration, or amplitude of behavior is altered by the presence of an antecedent stimulus. Next, we're going to talk about discrimination, generalization, and maintenance. Discrimination is teaching an individual to respond differently to different stimuli. Generalization is behavior is learned in one environment and is applied to others. So if you're teaching someone how to wash dishes, for example, I currently work with a client that has like a bento box, and at the end of the day, I have her clean her bento box because it's dirty and she used it. And if I wanted to see if this would generalize, I could do it. I could see if at home, after she eats dinner, if she cleans her plate. And the next thing is maintenance. So it's when behavior continues to occur over time. So our next question is, Joshua can find milk at home and at the grocery store. This is an example of generalization, discrimination, or maintenance. The answer is generalization. Next, we're going to talk about motivating operations. So it's an environmental that can either alter, increase, or decrease the reinforcing or punishing effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event, or it can alter, decrease the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced or punished by that stimulus, object, or event. So true or false, if Tori is thirsty, therefore water would be a motivating operation. This is true. So because Tori is thirsty, she's going to want water, which makes water reinforcing. However, if she was not thirsty and the reinforcer was water, it wouldn't be reinforcing. Next, my favorite topic is rule-governed versus contingency-shaped behavior. Rule-governed behavior is behavior controlled by a rule, which could be a verbal statement, and it enables human behavior to come under the indirect control of temporarily remote or improbable but significant consequences. Or there's also contingency behavior, which means behavior is acquired by direct experience with contingencies. So an example of this would be, I want to make sure, let me think of a different example. Don't touch the knife, it's very sharp. That would be an example of a rule-governed behavior. And if it was contingency shaped, maybe you were cutting some carrots and you sliced a little bit of your finger. Nothing crazy. That would be contingency shaped because you experienced the cutting of the finger. It happened to you. Whereas rule-governed, you didn't actually experience being cut. You just knew that the knife was sharp. So, is this rule-governed or contingency-shaped? Your mom telling you, do not touch the stove, and you never touch it is an example of rule-governed behavior. So the next section I'd like to go over, if I can move myself out of the way, are bands, tacks, intraverbals, and echoics. So bands are when you are requesting for a certain item. Tacks label the item. And an intraverbal is a verbal stimulus where you have someone respond with another verbal response. And an echoic is imitation. So an example of a man is saying cookie, then you receive the cookie. A tack could be, what I could show is you see this and you say clementine, it's a clementine. An intraverbal could be, how old are you? And then the client responds, I'm 19. And then an echoic, this you use mostly with students that have lower, verbal repertoire. So if I say, ah, and then the client responds, ah, that would be an echoic. And the last thing that we're going to discuss is derived stimulus relations, which is responding, indicating a relation. An example, same as, opposite, different from, better than, between two or more stimuli that emerges as an indirect function of related instruction or experience.